There are some additional bark beetles that need discussion, and this week we'll discuss those that are involved with deciduous trees, and furthermore, some of those that are involved in transmitting certain pathogens, notably fungi, to plants to create plant disease, such as Dutch elm disease. Later in the week, I want to shift to wood borers, a different class of insects that you find also developing within the trees and under the bark. So the learning objectives of this week are to become familiar with how some bark beetles can interact with fungi to produce plant disease. Recognize the patterns of injury produced by wood-boring insects. And finally, learn the principles of how to manage these wood borers and these bark beetles. So the first group that needs attention are those associated with the elms, the bark beetles that are associated with elms. And this also brings up Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease is a disease that involves an interaction between a fungal pathogen that produces the disease and an insect vector, a bark beetle in this situation. It is produced from infection specifically with a fungus known as Ophiostoma nova ulmi, and it is primarily moved from place to place by the smaller European elm bark beetle. The two of these organisms came to North America in the 1930s from some infested elm material that originated in Europe and has subsequently spread throughout the United States and much of Canada, causing devastating effects to American elm, a highly susceptible species to this fungus. The fungus will be associated with the xylem of the plant, so you are going to see effects from plugging of the xylem, and as a result, the symptoms you see on the tree from infection are wilting. So the xylem is no longer able to move water, and so we see wilting of a branch, then a larger branch, and then ultimately the entire tree. The progress of Dutch elm disease can be very rapid. A tree can be killed within a year after an initial infection from just a small introduction of the fungus into the plant. It then can move from tree to tree through root grafts, as we'll talk about. But this disease has transformed much of the landscaping in large areas of the United States. American elm was the premier street tree because of its shape and size, creating these cathedral-like effects where they were growing, the overarching branches. And American elm has largely been eliminated from the landscape in most of North America. Interestingly, in some of the western states, we probably have more elms than anywhere else at this point in time. But in large areas, it has been essentially eliminated. A devastating disease that's transformed how the American countryside and the American cities look. Now, the beetle that's involved in Dutch elm disease is a tiny bark beetle. The original one brought to the United States was the smaller European elm bark beetle, Scolytus multistriatus. Again, a very tiny bark beetle, and of itself, it is not a damaging pest. It is of itself a kind of bark beetle that would be almost entirely limited to developing in dead or dying limbs or trunks. So in this case, we can see larvae of the elm bark beetle developing underneath the bark. There is a central gallery, and then the larvae make their feeding galleries more or less perpendicular to the central egg gallery produced by the adult. And very large numbers can develop in a dying or recently killed elm log. But again, on their own, this is not a bark beetle that can take out and kill living trees, as can the mountain pine beetle. Pictures of the galleries that produced, again, central gallery by the adult, radiating galleries produced by the larvae. At the end of the galleries, they will pupate, and then they will emerge, cutting their way through the bark, making small little exit holes. Now, if the tree has been infected with Dutch elm disease, then the fungus may grow in large areas of the tree. And in this case, we're seeing the egg gallery with fruiting structures of the fungus growing in it, the egg gallery of the elm bark beetle. beetles that develop underneath the bark of a tree that has been infected with Dutch elm disease are often externally contaminated with spores of the fungus. So then when the beetles leave, they are also carrying with them the spores that could cause new infections. And how these new infections generally occur is through twig feeding by the adults. So the adult twig beetles, adult elm bark beetles will initially have a little bout of feeding, and these will be on green twigs of perfectly healthy trees, and making small little wounds as they feed. And if these beetles are carrying with them the spores of the fungus, then these can be moved into these wounds and affect an infection of the tree. So transmission of the fungus occurs during this twig feeding episode of the adult beetles, moving it into the wounds that they make. So the symptoms you're going to see are usually going to be high in the crown where the twig feeding occurs, and the fungus as it moves in will cause the plant to die back progressively, producing conspicuous flagging. Now again, the fungus moves into the xylem of the tree, and the result of this infection is a compromising of the xylem. Actually, the fungus itself doesn't block the xylem, but the tree's hyper response to infection will plug the xylem, and with the xylem plugged, water cannot move, and you get the progressive dying back of the limbs, and ultimately the whole tree. You also will usually see some sort of vascular discoloration in affected limbs and eventually even the trunk. Furthermore, once a tree has become infected, if there are nearby elm trees, and often elm have been planted in large rows, then additional transmission can then occur through root grafts. If the trees are growing next to each other, often they have roots that are grafting to each other, and the fungus moves systemically in the plant. It could then move to the next tree, and then to the next tree, and then into the next tree. So even if the beetles only infect one tree, a whole stand of trees could ultimately be killed through subsequent root graft transmission. Dutch elm disease can be managed. It is largely a sanitation situation where it can be quite effectively managed in many parts of the country, including most of the western states. This requires a program for regularly surveying to detect new infections, prompt and immediate removal of all infected trees without any hesitation, and there is some, although not a lot, of value to the use of pesticides, but this is primarily a sanitation issue. So any place where American elm are being grown in the western U.S., these are almost always regularly surveyed, usually 2 times a year by city forestry or parks personnel, to try to detect early stage symptoms of trees that are infected. Again, what you're looking for would be suspect flagging at the top of the crown where a beetle might have introduced the fungus in the first place. If you then took samples of the tree, you might see vascular staining, which would be highly suggestive that it is Dutch elm disease, but confirmation of Dutch elm disease is done with a culture of a twig sample from some area symptomatic of the tree. These would be sent to a lab. Here in Colorado, it would be the Plant Disease Lab at Colorado State University, where these can be quickly cultured, and within a couple of days it can be determined whether or not the fungus is present in that sample that was provided. If it is infected, then prompt and immediate removal of infected trees is required, and this is done as soon as possible. If it can't be done immediately, then the first thing that is often done is some sort of girdling of the tree, and that's what's being affected right here. So we also can see a couple of different girdles done at this point. So as soon as it's detected, some girdling is usually done, and the reason for this is to try to prevent the fungus from moving into the roots. If it hasn't already moved into the roots, then this may prevent the movement to the roots so that you wouldn't get the subsequent root graft transmission. So that's sometimes done immediately to prevent the graft transmission. However, as soon as possible, that tree must be removed, and it must be removed before the beetles that are developing within that emerge, because if they are in an affected tree, they may be carrying the spores of the fungus and then could inoculate new trees. The beetle has 2 generations a year, so fairly rapid life cycle, and again, removal and disposal of those trees is the way that this disease is managed. They cannot be, there's no tolerance for leaving a tree that is infected for any longer than is possible, than you need to. It has to come out as soon as possible. And usually there are often laws in place that require that this be done, at least for most communities. Sanitation is key. There is some use of insecticides and fungicides to help with managing Dutch elm disease, although these are far less important and can only supplement the other approaches involving sanitation. So insecticides can be used. The insecticides that are used for Dutch elm disease would be ones that are applied in the canopy of the tree that would be targeting the adult beetles before they engage in that twig feeding. Now this of course requires spraying right in the top of the tree. May even need a couple of applications a year, and obviously quite a difficult thing to do, have to be repeated over time. There are also fungicides that are sometimes used in managing Dutch elm disease, and these would be inoculated generally into the root flares of the tree and move systemically. These fungicides can be fairly effective if a tree has not been very seriously compromised by Dutch elm disease. If typically less than 5% of the crown has symptoms that show Dutch elm disease, then these can help reverse or at least retard the further progress of the disease. However, all the pesticide applications, be it fungicides or insecticides, quite expensive to do, have to be done repeatedly. And again, the key to Dutch elm disease is sanitation, the prompt and immediate removal of infected trees. There's one last issue that I want to bring up related to bark beetles on elm, and that is that the situation has recently changed. In the mid-2000s, 2004, another kind of bark beetle was discovered in Colorado called the banded elm bark beetle, and subsequently, when people started looking, they found it in essentially every western state where they could look. And it is very closely related to the previous bark beetle that became established in North America, the smaller European elm bark beetle, and has very similar habits. And one thing that has happened is that this new species, this banded elm bark beetle, seems to be extremely well adapted to at least the western U.S. and has now become the dominant bark beetle associated with elm. By the way, it does also move the fungus for Dutch elm disease, so it could be a vector as well. So what we've seen is, in a very short period of time, what I would call it the elm bark beetle handoff, where originally the smaller European elm bark beetle was the species we had. Again, this is the one that came over in the 1930s along with the fungus that produces Dutch elm disease. And that has been what we've had for some 80 odd years. In the last decade, we've become aware of the second species. And both of these are very similar in terms of their habits. So the banded elm bark beetle develops underneath the bark of trees that are dead and dying, as does the European elm bark beetle. They also engage in twig feeding behavior, similar to the smaller European elm bark beetle. And they've both got 2 generations. However, both species pretty much do the same thing. You find them in the same part of the plant and feeding in the same areas. However, the banded elm bark beetle adults come out earlier, a couple weeks earlier than the smaller European elm bark beetle. And the second generation also is ahead. So what we have is a situation where the banded elm bark beetle has progressively pushed off pushed away the previous bark beetle through competitive displacement. Within 10 years after its discovery, this new bark beetle of elm seems to have largely exterminated the previous elm bark beetle. Yeah, one of the very few cases where we see competitive displacement, certainly in such a dramatic way, being affected by any kind of insect. So the situation with elm bark beetles has changed. We have a new bark beetle that is here that's essentially eliminated the previous one, but Dutch elm disease is still transmitted by both of these. Anyway, that's it for the elm bark beetles. Let's move on to a couple more.